Good morning, I'm Tom Goedkoop from Booz Allen, and will serve as the panel moderator for the Building the Holodeck panel discussion this morning. I'm sure that General Sullivan's question will be answered during the course of this panel, but certainly not by me. This is the last presentation before the end of the symposium, and we thank you for your support of this critical readiness-related panel. General Sullivan and the AUSA team, thanks for all you do for our Army. You are the voice of the Army, and this important symposium proves it once again. We have a great topic this morning, which is critical to the preparation and execution of the development of the Army of 2025 that we've heard so much about during the past few days, as well as being critical to the return to readiness of our Army as we reset after 12 years of war in the face of budget shortages. We must learn to train more effectively at lower costs with reduced manpower requirements across all components of the Army, active, guard, and reserve. Emerging simulations technology can assist in this process. Believe you'll hear some great ideas from our panel experts on some initiatives that are being developed within PEO STRI, other government agencies, academia, and industry. We have a distinguished panel here today. Their bios are in your program, but would like to highlight a few of their accomplishments. Starting to my immediate right is our panel chair, Dr. Jim Blake, the Program Executive Officer for Simulation, Training, Instrumentation, or better known as PEO STRI. He's responsible for providing material, solutions, and services in modeling, simulation training, test and instrumentation to support the soldier. Next is Dr. Mike Macedonia. He's a Vice President and Technical Fellow at SAIC before joining the University of Central Florida. He was also Director of the Disruptive Technology Office, now IARPA, for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The DTO was the United States intelligence community's centrally funded research activity for advanced technology. Prior to DTO, he was the Chief Technology Officer for PEO STRI in Orlando, Florida. To Mike's right is Mr. Paul S. Hill. Paul Hill, Director of Mission Operations for NASA. In this position, he's responsible for all aspects of Mission Operations Directorate support for manned spaceflight. Prior to his current position, he was Manager of Shuttle Operations, Mission Operations Directorate, Johnson Space Center. And finally, on the far right is Dr. Todd Richmond, the Director of Advanced Prototype Development and Transition at the University of Southern California Institute for Creative Technologies. At ICT, he works in a variety of areas, including counter-IED training systems, involving video, narrative, immersive environments, and geo-specific multiplayer gaming scenarios, interactive education, including serious games and simulations, visualization, messaging, and media as agents of change, and viral media and building learning communities. I hope you enjoy the presentations and challenge our participants with insightful questions as we continue to develop more effective and realistic training environments for our Army. I'll now pass the helm to our chair, Jim Blake.
Thank you. Well, good morning. I appreciate this opportunity to share with you some current information beyond our organizations concerning building holodecks for the future. I will also discuss how the technology behind building a holodeck is currently assisting our soldiers as they train for current operations in Afghanistan and any conflict that occurs in the future. I first became involved in discussions about building a holodeck back at the turn of the millennium when I was appointed the first program manager for the Institute for Creative Technologies. The Institute, if you don't know it, is a U.S. Army-funded facility in Los Angeles that works with Hollywood talent to create high-end training and education simulations. We worked closely then with Paramount Studios, who produced Star Trek. In fact, we had the facility designed by Herman Zimmerman, who was a set designer for Star Trek. The saying back then was that real holodecks were 24th century inventions, very expensive. There would only be one per starship, and while that still may be true, the generic strides that made technology see the last 14 years has placed us on the cusp of putting the imaginary holodeck in use in everyday life. I hope that answered your question, General Sullivan, with the holodeck. We'll dig a little deeper. All right. Last month, New York Times published an article titled "The Holodeck Begins to Take Shape," in which the author said scientists and researchers believe we could have something like a holodeck by 2024. The article talks about how the race is on to bring a computer-generated version of reality to the point that movie buffs would actually become part of the story by being immersed with actors and even talking with them in their own living rooms. He also points out that something close to an actual holodeck could reduce business travel in the future, making corporate meetings less expensive. Instead of flying to a destination, staying at a hotel, and taking a taxi for a 30-minute meeting, the attendees could save time and money by attending the meeting via augmented virtual reality. This is just taking it one step further than what the Army already does in its video conferencing. The article mentioned, though, that there is a possible downside with the emerging technology. Just as today's parents worry their children spend too much time playing video games, Dr. Mikio Kaku, a theoretical physicist, warned that one day people might prefer to live in a virtual world rather than a real one. And with these budget drills, I think some of us may feel that way already. Another recent article, published last December in the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers Spectrum magazine, says technology is very close to taking virtual reality mainstream in the gaming industry. The writer centers his article on a low-cost headset that will be available this year, allowing third-party game developers to use their creative skills to get them into the hands of the consumers. While this $300 headset was the brainchild of Palmer Luckey, he wasn't able to refine his research until he became a head-mounted display designer in 2011 at the Institute for Creative Technologies. And that's my old stomping ground. When he demonstrated his device at the Electronic Entertainment Expo in Los Angeles, it was a big hit with the gaming industry. The article said one popular game site heralded this device called the Rift as being the closest we've come to Star Trek's holodeck, while another called it a gaming experience with a level of immersion genuinely unlike anything else we've ever experienced. Currently, the article states, the most popular application now for this is virtual cinema. Now, the United States Army has certainly taken advantage of some of that technology and is using it today to train our soldiers. The system I'm going to show you today is called Dismounted Soldier Training System. It allows a squad of up to 9 soldiers to enter a nondescript room and, after suiting up, be virtually transported together to a geospecific combat zone that's alive with three-dimensional, 360-degree sights and sounds on the battlefield. This video will provide you an excellent overview of the Dismounted Soldier Training System. Would you please run the video?
Introducing the first ever fully immersive virtual simulation training solution for U.S. soldiers. The Dismounted Soldier Training System is a revolutionary approach for increasing the quality of instruction and combat preparedness for soldiers. The training system offers a limitless number of virtual scenarios that recreate environments and combat situations in lifelike detail. It is an innovative, out-of-the-box ready training system designed to be flexible, easily portable, and transportable, ready to be used in under 4 hours. Soldiers are fully immersed in an environment where they can see and hear and communicate with members of their squad, platoon, or company. The soldier's entire body is utilized to perform complex motion maneuvers via mimicking, such as leaning around or under an obstacle or issuing hand signals. All of the soldier's natural movements are translated to their virtual avatar within the game engine. The Dismounted Soldier Training System integrates wearable technology for each trainee, including a helmet-mounted display that integrates a head tracker, stereo speakers, and microphone for voice and radio communications. A light backpack contains a CPU for processing the display of the 3D virtual environment within the HMD. Sensors track body positions that are mapped precisely to the virtual environment. Instrumented weapons with optics, sights, and scopes are also used. The modular design and hardened cases of the Dismounted Soldier Training System make for convenient shipping, and their multi-use functionality allows them to be utilized as operational desks and cabinets. The system consists of 9 virtual soldier manned modules, 5 multifunctional workstations, an exercise control and semi-automated forces station, and an after-action review workstation. Each squad member is assigned a 100-square-foot training area, with the system's overall spatial requirement being approximately 1,600 square feet. The Dismounted Soldier Training System, the future of virtual training, has arrived.
Well, that's pretty amazing stuff, and just as an example of how far technology has come, Back in 1968, the very first head-mounted display was created by Mr. Ivan Sutherland. It was so heavy that it had to be suspended from the ceiling. And today we're into throwaway devices. So the Dismounted Soldier Training System has been very well received by our soldiers and their leaders. Colonel J. Peterson, the Assistant Commandant of the Infantry School, recently had this to say about the system, and I quote, "Soldiers look into it, and all of a sudden, they're in a village. There are civilians moving on the battlefield, and there are IEDs and vehicles moving. If utilized right, you can put a squad in that environment every day and give them yet one more twist." We're very excited about employing this technology to ensure our soldiers are second to none on the battlefield, and will continue to improve on the realism of the training as the technology evolves. Now, like you, I'm very interested in hearing from the members of this panel to get their perspective on the holodeck. So I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Jim. Next person to speak will be Dr. Michael Macedonia.
Hello, everyone. And just I want to correct the record because I know my SAC colleagues are probably falling out of their chairs right now. I have not gone back to work at SAC. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Research at the second largest university in the country, University of Central Florida, number 10 football team in the country, by the way. So, the holodeck actually has a long history. In fact, it was first described by Ray Bradbury in a series of short stories called The Illustrated Man. The story was called The Veldt. 11 pages. You can actually find it online and read it. It takes about 15 minutes. It is the creepiest story I've continued to believe because it was written in 1950. And think about this, 5 years after World War II. And Bradbury describes a house, a living house essentially, where you walk into a particular room and whatever you're thinking, where your kids are thinking, appears in the room, instantiated. And we find that in the, again, future later, in Star Trek Next Generation. That's what you end up seeing. But I find it amazing that somebody back in 1950 had that view without all the technology around us to be able to see the potential, the possibility of such a technological world that could generate that capability. Fast forward to 1983, a place called Kirschgons, The Rock. And in fact, my former brigade commander is in front here. And I like to think that back in 1983, if Patton was alive then, he would not have been surprised by anything he saw at The Rock. I mean, in terms of technology. The Army basically hadn't done very much in terms of, we didn't have the M1 Abrams tank yet. That was for the 84, when we first got them. All those great sensors, and frankly, the only computer that I know of back in 1983 in an infantry or armor unit was the Wang word processor that we were allowed to have one of. But we were still using manual typewriters. IBM Selectrics were banned. In fact, at one point, the Army banned computers from the battalions. I think it was 85. So we're at this point where it's 1983. Like I said, Patton would not be surprised. But then something happened. Something dramatically happened. Is we got this chief of staff back in the early 1990s who said, "Hey, there's two things that we really, really need to do." Actually, there were three things. One is we need to have digitization. Essentially, is the world is becoming IT-centric, computer-centric. Essentially, the Army has to catch up. In fact, has to get in front of its competitors in that area. And the other thing is we need to be able to use the power of simulation in order to change how we do business, whether it's training or planning in the Army. In fact, I think the most radical thing that I've ever seen in the Army, back then, and it was the early 90s, I was a techno guy, but I thought the most radical thing I thought was when they canceled Reforger, because I liked Reforgers. You know, they spent millions and maybe billions of dollars, and we'd have lots of fun out in the German countryside and all that sort of stuff. And we thought, well, if they cancel Reforger, this is to training. What's going to happen with all this training? And somebody said, well, you know, these constructive simulations are pretty good because what we really need to do is train the people who need the training, which is the planning and the staffs and the commanders and leaders, not 500,000 soldiers who are waiting around for something to happen. And that really was the beginning, I think, of the computer revolution in the Army, the digital revolution. And that's also the beginning of Stricom, simulators such as SimNet, which became the Combined Arms Tactical Trainer, thanks to visions from the vision of people like General Gorman, and introduced this type of capability and made us the most advanced Army in the world in terms of training capability, the best trained Army in the world. But you know, things are changing. The holodeck, as you see, is actually quite close. I mean, the vision of a holodeck, of Ray Bradbury's holodeck, is not that far away. Just as in 2014, we might as well be 100 years away from 1983. Think about that. I mean, like I said, 1983, Patton would have shown up, he would have recognized everything, including the half tracks in front of 236 infantry, okay? So, but today, I mean, he would find this was a radical new world. And what's radical about it? Well, I'm going to give a shout out to Georgia Tech, because I think you all ought to take a look at one of the things that they're doing. They've just created an institute, a program oriented on the Internet of Things. And that's actually sort of a marketing term, but for Cisco and a number of companies. But it's the whole idea that the whole world is being digitized. Everything you touch has a microprocessor. There are billions of microprocessors now being manufactured every year. So everything that you touch, okay, is got a computer essentially being built into it, from cars to shirts to everything in your kitchen and your living room. In fact, one of the biggest mergers this year involved Google and a company called Nest, who you may not even heard of before, but it's a company that makes thermostats, and they spend billions of dollars on thermostats. Why? Because Google wants to get into your house, okay, and because those microprocessors are going to basically turn your home into the holodeck. And then there's other technologies out there that I've heard discussed here. People have mentioned the cloud. People have mentioned robots. Essentially, these are all things that we're going to have to try and figure out how to work with and react to. We're virtualizing basically everything around us. A robot is a virtual soldier, right? A virtual does something for you. Okay. UAVs, they're virtual airmen in the flying above you. So in a sense, is the environment around you. If we're going into large cities, mega cities is the target for the future in terms of our battlefield, those cities are alive. Those cities are automated. They have transportation systems, computerized networks everywhere. We're going to have to figure out how we mesh into that. So then, by the way, I think the next 14 years compared to the last 14 years are going to be incredibly dramatic. And what you see with the holodeck, it won't surprise you. It's the things that we haven't even imagined yet will. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Paul Hill from NASA.
So you can imagine that in human spaceflight, virtually all of our training is conducted with simulations and with simulators. When you consider that the real world environment, when we in fact are in real time, is either at the top of a rocket with 7 million pounds of fire shooting out of the back end, or in orbit traveling 17,000 miles an hour, or somewhere further than orbit traveling even faster than that. So we have always relied heavily on simulations and simulators. Over the last 20 years, virtual reality has taken on an increasing role in the training that we provide, both to astronauts and to the folks that sit in mission control. Thankfully, consumer IT, you think about PCs, all of the different industries that cropped up around PCs and networking and various IT industry, internet-based industries. That has gone so fast and so far that the capability for us to build new simulations, new simulators has increased dramatically. The cost has gone down just as dramatically without us having to then invest in those technologies that we're now able to leverage and put in place in the simulators and in mission control. And while all that's happened, the resolution of those sims, the thoroughness of the simulation that we can provide to the operators has continued to go up. So I'll give you just an example from, say, our spacewalk training experience. And when you think about flying in space, you have piloting the spaceship, you have spacewalking, you have using robot arms. There is a wide variety of things we train, but just picking on spacewalk, so putting astronauts in suits and sending them outside. For years, in fact, since the 60s, since Buzz Aldrin first went underwater to demonstrate some spacewalking techniques, we have used underwater and a neutral buoyant environment to train our astronauts in as good of a simulated environment or virtual environment for the space experiences we can give them. But it's not perfect. It comes with its problems. For example, the water in the pool puts drag against the suit. The suit doesn't feel exactly the same underwater as it does in space. The astronaut is in fact sitting down on the bottom part of the suit, which would not happen in space. So there's a number of things that aren't accurate. As VR has come along, we have leveraged VR heavily, starting with computer-based simulations that look like cartoons that you watched on a display. That progressed to headsets, which then progressed to 3D helmets, and even 3D helmets with instrumented gloves that, no kidding, put the astronauts right in that computer-based experience. Still wasn't the same, still very cartoon-like. By about the year 2000, we had enhanced that even with robots that we suspended from wires that had load cells built into them. And the astronauts could actually handle these robots, and through their helmet, they saw some piece of space hardware that was outside that they were handling that was designed to behave exactly the way some 2,000-pound object with some strange inertias would behave in zero gravity. Still wasn't perfect. We still had experienced astronauts that would have to come back and go through the long list of things that were not the same as when they had just done that same activity out in space, which then takes us back into the water. With all of that said, we took the combination of all of those different types of training to expose the astronauts so that the first time they ever went outside was the first time they really were in the vacuum of space, in harm's way, in the spacesuit. And our astronauts have always been blindingly successful in doing that work. But it's those inaccuracies that have to be intentionally assessed, whether it was going in the water, different parts of the VR that were not exactly the way the experience was in space. And that's for a couple of different reasons. The folks that develop the simulations for us frequently will focus on that last 15% of goodness. How can I keep doing it? If I just do a little bit more work, throw me another $5 million and we can make this better. Or God help us, that last 5% of goodness, and the price goes up geometrically. But worse, solving that problem that you're continuing to throw more money at, trying to make the sim make up for the differences between the real experience and the simulated, becomes a target in and of itself. And the thing that we have to battle against is losing focus on the actual training that we're trying to give these folks, the experience that we're trying to expose them to before we send them out in harm's way. Now we are chasing the simulation for the simulation's sake. And the concern that we have besides that cost is when we deliver it, the sim that sometimes we deliver just for the sake of the sim, sometimes we actually missed the real training we had set out to give our operators in the first place. And worse, sometimes we've given them negative training, where they then got into the real environment and executed exactly the way we trained them and broke space hardware or put themselves at risk of losing their life and certainly having cost us the mission, all because of those inaccuracies that we built into the simulation. So our focus is very strongly internal to the mission control world at JSC when it comes to our training, especially those things that we are simulating. For the real-time critical decision-making where we know somebody's going to take action, they are managing risk in real time. Our focus, if not our paranoia, is strongly on those inaccuracies. And as you develop similar training for your warfighters, I encourage the same thing. Focus heavily on the parts that the warfighter comes back and criticizes the sim and says, this isn't accurate enough, and which part of this could lead our people in real time to now execute the way we trained them and do exactly the wrong thing.
Thanks, Paul. Todd, please.
So just to test your profiling skills, can everybody tell who on this panel is the academic from Southern California based on visual patterns? I can't help it, I only own one suit and I was married in it and I'll be buried in it. So 10 years ago, your mobile phone was barely a phone. Now this is not only an object of commercial desire, but it's a platform for social, economic, and political change. So this is a truly disruptive technology. And the way that this is ramped up, when you talked about from the 50s to 1983, we're in a very steep part of the curve right now. 5 years ago, as Jim talked about, head-mount displays were very expensive, and he in fact challenged Mark Bolas in our lab to make it cheaper, and Oculus Rift is one outgrowth of that. It's $299. But I'll beat that. I can take this commodity tablet and take $5 worth of plastic lenses and a 3D printed viewer, and I've now got a fully immersive environment that, oh, by the way, has a camera and a network connection, and I can put whatever content I want. So I can now connect training capabilities and operational capabilities and have this fully immersive. And this is $5 using hardware that people probably already have. At CES, FLIR showed an IR camera that snaps on the back of an iPhone for $350. We don't own the Night anymore. It's another disruptive technology. 10 years ago, we had to argue about whether or not games were effective for training people. We don't have that argument anymore. We know that they learn. It's just a question of what you learn and how well they learn it. And as Paul talked about, this issue of positive versus negative training and being very careful. When we design things, our number one rule is no negative training. The other rule that comes out of our group is prototype early and often, because frankly, I want to make a very quick 20% solution and see where it fails. We love failure because we learn in failure. I don't want to sit around and, to quote my retired 06 Marine colleague, I don't want to sit around and admire the problem too long. I want to figure out what the gap is, and when someone comes to us with a gap, usually they're reporting a symptom, not a disease. So we want to tease out what the gaps are, figure out a way to attack it, and then very quickly build something. The beauty of digital is that you can prototype in minutes and hours instead of in months and years. So we want to leverage that capability. What used to be science fiction is now science fact. Google just announced Project Tango yesterday. This is a phone that's got 3D capabilities, so I can scan a 3D environment and then build out a 3D space. That's, again, commodity technology that's going to disrupt the way that we do things. The problem is that the Googles of the world and the Oculuses of the world and all of the great technology vendors, they're going to push the envelope and they're going to make the next new shiny object. And they're going to figure out how to use that to sell things, how to entertain people, and then, of course, the adult entertainment industry is probably going to be on the bleeding edge of figuring out how to leverage the new technology, because they always are. But what lags behind is the training and learning. Those commercial companies will not be spending their precious dollars to focus on leveraging the capabilities to do that. And that's where I think a lot of us are going to have to come in for taking these commodity objects and using them effectively. We know that soon people are going to be spending hours in immersive environments and head-mounted displays. But what does it mean to communicate and collaborate in those types of spaces? Right now, we're working on a project with Office of Naval Research. They came to us and said, the next generation of sailors are in kindergarten right now. This is a generation that's never known a world without touch interfaces. For them, this means zooming something. That didn't mean something to the rest of us when we were growing up. And their question is, what are they going to expect when they walk in the workplace? How are we going to recruit and retain? And then how are we going to start building our systems to take advantage of these capabilities? So we're starting to prototype these things out, because we can now break time and space. We can combine physical and virtual and augmented realities. What does that mean for people working together? Because no matter how many cool sensors you've got, at some point, a human has to make a decision. So when I walked the booths yesterday and talked to a lot of great companies who have very cool things, almost all of them said, you know what, we're system integrators. That's what we do. And I use the same line for ICT. We're system integrators, but the big part of the system that we're focused on is the 6 inches between the ears and integrating the human into that piece, because I don't care how good the technology is, if a human can't use that and it's not actionable, then it's not going to be effective and we've wasted our money. So issues around cognitive overload, sense making, artificial intelligence, virtual entities, we can do almost anything. but we're really trying to figure out how we can make this so that it's useful to a human being. The other thing is that leaders now, traditionally a squad has been 9 or 13 depending on where you are, but they're leading men and women. In the not too distant future, and actually currently, leaders are going to be commanding a combination of men, women, robots, autonomous, semi-autonomous, remotely piloted vehicles. What does that mean for a leader? And how do you train a leader to deal with those types of things? Mark poses a very interesting question in the not too distant future. Would you take a bullet for your robot? That will be a very real consideration because some of those tools may be more important to the mission. And we don't know how that dynamic's going to play out and how we're going to train the leaders for that. The way that we're going to figure it out is by doing it. The other kind of dangerous point is the bad guys will have these toys too. They can buy these things. They'll have the IR cameras. And while we can move into a place where we're going to have largely cyber and RF warfare, the reality is that it's going to be this mix, and we call it an emulsion, of physical, virtual, and augmented. And that's the reality. For years, we've talked about trying to merge training and ops. You fight as you train as you fight. The reality is that instead of the training moving more towards being the fighting is actually coming more towards the training with the increase in the virtual, and you've got guys in Omaha that are flying birds out over the desert. So while we thought we were trying to move the training to the ops is actually coming back to us. And again, in this environment, how are we going to make it so that a human being can actually make a decision and lead and succeed? And those are very hard questions.
Okay, some great introductory comments. We've gotten quite a few questions from the audience that you'll continue to expand on this. Jim, I'll give the first one to you here since this is a kind of a government-related question. Technology advances much more quickly than the JSID's process. How do we avoid the pitfall of being tied to legacy requirements, systems, and programs of record?
Yeah, I wish I had a solution for that. What we try to encourage people to do on these programs is to build in technology insertion capability and to look far enough out that we can tie the tech base through a 30-year plan to our current acquisition strategies so that we have some way of transitioning good ideas into programs of record. There are a few examples of that. We've used the ICT work many times to transition, but the staffing for JSIDS itself is a multi-year opportunity, and then the contracting opportunity to get the solution set in place is also a multi-year. There are some efforts for things like the REF that could speed it up, and there are other concepts where you could look at technology demonstrators where if it's software principally, it could be transitioned very quickly.
All righty. And I know that just from our work that it's not only the simulation world that has the problem of the JSID's bureaucracy and logjam. Mike, will cyber have unique simulations and training needs, and what are they?
Well, it was fascinating to hear General Cardon's speech the other day, because talk about everything existing in the virtual world. You have eventually 6,000 young men and women sitting at terminals imagining they're fighting an enemy. They don't actually see them. They're looking at screens and trying to anticipate the attack on cyber infrastructure. So I think one of the big challenges we have is developing a training capability for everybody, not just those 6,000 operators who have TSSCI clearances, but for the rest of humanity and the rest of the Army to be able to operate and train in such an environment. If cyber warfare can take out an entire brigade in minutes, then those soldiers that are operating that equipment in combat need to know more than need more than just annual IA training.
Okay, thanks. Todd, here's one for you. How much work do you do in studying how humans learn? how does this affect how you develop simulations?
So on the prototype side and the basic research side, we have people in the building who are focused on learning sciences. So we have people that have come out of the School of Education, and then people who are focused on just the core issues of what constitutes cognitive overload, what types of, we spend a lot of blood, sweat, and tears trying to figure out how we do assessment better. We don't want to, if we build a training system designed to train something, we don't want it to do negative training, but we also know that we have to do assessment not only of the learner and build a model of that learner, but also then assess other factors around ROI increasingly, and effectiveness and efficacy. So we collaborate with people on the main campus and at ARL, and we're agnostic. We'll work with anybody who's interested in working with us on that. But the learning science piece is absolutely mission critical to any piece of training that we'll end up building out.
I'll throw this out to all the panel members, and the one that has the best definition of the holodeck, you could answer first. If you were to craft our Army vision for the use of the holodeck, what would it be?
Well, obviously training is obvious, but I want to go back to what General Sullivan saw with simulation, because essentially is he was able to peer into the future. I mean, with Louisiana maneuvers, and I think that's really, I mean, that's the power behind simulation, is the what ifs, the bounding of the problems, the exploration. And I think that if I had the holodeck of today, that's what I would be really pushing on right now, because we need to peer into 2025 right now.
What strikes me as interesting about this is three domains, live, virtual, and constructive. It seems to me what we're hearing from Dr. Richmond is that the balls have been driven together so that I have one system, I pay $1, and I now can do live work. That is, I can go to combat, having trained on my vehicle, or participated in larger training, which is a version of live, Louisiana maneuvers, Reforger, large. This gets to be profound because for the budgeteers, you're only buying one piece of equipment for the vehicle, say a tank or a Bradley or a helicopter, as opposed to three separate systems. Is that what you're telling us, that we're there and don't know it?
Well, so there's a lot of talk about federated systems, and we've got all of these training systems. Major General Braun, when he was down, was talking about we have to get our systems integrated. Bob Braun. And I would argue that there is an excellent model for the ultimate federated system that works with a very limited number of protocols and parameters and enables an incredibly diverse set of things to do. And for most people, it's almost cheap, and that's the internet. It is a system of systems. Somebody didn't sit down and design the Uber internet. It came out of a core set of protocols, and everybody can plug in. If you want to go off and do your own thing and behind a wall garden or some special thing, you absolutely can do that, and you pass whatever information is relevant. So we've got a really good model for how we might do these sorts of things. The other thing, the live virtual constructive gaming is compressing down. At the last talks that I was at a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about, okay, it's live and synthetic, and I actually drew that, because I'm from the left coast, as a yin-yang with a dotted line, because live and synthetic are starting to merge, and it's getting to the point where you may be doing live in operations, but your control is from a synthetic standpoint, and conversely, you may be doing synthetic operations, but you're doing it in a live location. So we're really starting do some very profound things around breaking time and space, being able to work synchronously, asynchronously, different places, different times, different languages, different cultures, and the problems become manifold and it spreads out from there.
Not only do the problems become manifold, but for the decision maker, it becomes hard to visualize what you're saying because, in my terminology, show me the Grecian urn. I can read the poem, but if I can see the urn, I understand what he's really saying in the poem. I think there has to be some awareness at the top.
So for us, we talk about narrative. It's got to tell a story, right? And right now, PowerPoint briefs, when you brief up or brief down, a PowerPoint brief doesn't tell a story.
You know, my colleague here, Scott Wallace, is telling me that I have to, I've read Heinlein, Starship Troopers, I got that, but what I don't have yet is the entrance, where all of a sudden this guy gets to the end, and now I was really doing it and didn't know I was doing it.
Beca-
That gets to be,
I mean, that's the way it is in cyber today, in cyber warfare. Do you really know that you're fighting an enemy in a cyber simulation? You don't see blood, you don't see anybody die, all you see is blips on the screen. Same way as on a Navy ship, 4 decks down in a CIC, it's virtual warfare. Or for an Air Force pilot who's sitting in China Lake flying a plane over Afghanistan.
well, we have to be careful how far we take this, okay? Because when if you get out of Fort Huachuca, what you're going to find is interrogators who enlist to be interrogators. Many of them find that they don't like looking someone in the eye
Right.
because they have grown up standing next to their girlfriends with texting. And some of this gets kind of esoteric, but I think this panel, by the way, is much more powerful than I think most people realize, and the implications of it in the future are profound. But remember, the Army's mission is not to have only 3 guys or 1 guy on the deck of the ship in the middle of the night traveling between San Francisco and LA. It's to have soldiers who can get on the ground and actually do something.
Well, it's to do something. It's to win wars. And then we figure out how we win wars. We go back from there.
In theory, winning wars is one of the missions, but the other is to reassure our allies and to work with others. You know, simulations help us speak other languages and so forth.
But at some point, you're right, a human being, boots on the ground, has to do something. We're increasingly giving them more and more capabilities and more sensors, and I would actually argue that it's paralysis by analysis at some point. So one of our big deals is, again, at some point it's going to be a human making the decision. So how can we figure out how to take all of these capabilities and tell a story that becomes actionable?
I'll tell you the distinction you have to hold on to is the difference between how much of the operation do you want to make artificial or virtual versus now how do you train whatever the experience is for the operator, whether the operator is sitting in a control room, say the way we have flown spacecraft for 5 decades now, where we have engineers and mission control remote controlling the spacecraft, but with real astronauts living with the results of what we're doing to them on the spacecraft and then doing other things out in the environment. But once you've established however you're going to operate, then you have to take into consideration, now what's the environment of the mission where it's really happening and where the operator is that's making the decisions. How much of that do we simulate or emulate? And when we simulate, how much are we introducing artificial error that's going to encourage them to do the wrong thing? So they're 2 separate propositions. And as I said, in the mission control world, we've accepted for decades, I mean, since we first started this business, it's remote control. But now, how do we make sure that we give the operator, whether it's the guy on board the spacecraft or mission control, the actual experience and not encourage them or train them to do the wrong thing because we got the simulation wrong, or we simulated the environment wrong because it was cheaper than a full-up simulation.
Yeah, a comment I'd like to add, Paul, and this goes back to one of your comments earlier about simulation for simulation's sake or whatever. And there are, in my opinion, lots of unique capabilities that are being developed. And we saw the DSTS here for the squad. My question becomes, do we chase the simulation and the latest thing, and we don't spend enough money to scale the simulations across a division? So having a, and Jim, I'm just using this as an example, having a DSTS on a division post that trains one squad and not the other 400, and what's the throughput, and then how do you get battalions, brigades, divisions into the fight in a realistic manner, as opposed to, because Paul, your problem is training individuals primarily in that thing, and one and two-person small groups. How do you spend enough time, effort, and expand the simulation to do thousands of people at the same time in a realistic time period, and then phase it so that you don't have one at Fort X this year and one at Fort Y 3 years from now, and so we fielded it, but we really don't train the Army, we train a post.
It's a valid point about the difference in scale that, in fact, the fact that I am trying to train a handful of astronauts a year,
Right.
maybe a few hundred mission controllers per year, that alone has caused us in the last few years to step way back away from the leading edge of development because it's just too damn expensive per hour of training. And I would rather let the gaming industry develop things that I can buy for $5,000. In fact, I'm almost finished rehosting the entire space station simulator, and I'll finish this in the next year, that it will cost me $50,000 a piece to generate a new string of the simulator. 5 years ago, it would have cost me between $5 and $10 million per string for a simulator that was already fully engineered. And at our scale, it doesn't make sense for me to do it any other way. Now, for as large a scope as the Army's faced with, maybe it makes sense to stay closer to the leading edge and then amortize that cost across all soldiers. At the risk of, it will always be most expensive at the front of the technology.
The other part of the scaling problem, I mean, we also look at one of my favorite pet projects is K through 12 education. It's profoundly broken. We're in now an environment that digital has changed everything. So if you stop to think about just LA Unified School District, that's a pretty big battalion of kids that you're trying to train. The danger that we have, and this is what the government oftentimes is good at in various ways. I don't know if anybody heard about what happened with LA Unified about a year ago. They got some funding and they decided that they're going to be on the leading edge. Everybody has to have a tablet, so they gave iPads to a bunch of the high school students in LA Unified. And within about 3 days, the LA Unified main computers were hacked and grades were changed by the students that used those. Now, so that's the second order consequence, right, of thinking they were doing good by throwing shiny objects at the problem without understanding the capabilities. As a person who's into training, I actually would argue that that was a win because they engaged some students and that they embraced, the students then engaged in creative behavior to try and accomplish a goal. So there actually was a training win there. LA Unified viewed it as a lose-lose, right? They spent all this money and then they got hacked. So they not only missed it on the front end of they shouldn't have given these out without having a plan for how to use them, then they also lost out on the fact that they actually did achieve a result. So the scaling thing gets dangerous when we come up with a solution that we think works for a small contained group, and then we try and push it out without really understanding what the second and third order consequences are going to be.
So I'd like to comment on that. Let's use the DSTS as an example. So we fielded 37 of those suites to 28 different installations. Whenever we go with a program of record, we have a basis of issue, and we have an acquisition objective. We know how many we want for the Army so the Army can train. And we really don't want to field them all at one time. We really do want to field them a little at a time so that we can get feedback as people use them, so that if there are changes that need to be incorporated, we can incorporate them when they're very affordable. Hence, we use LREP or other mechanisms to make sure that we can control the costs associated with it. What usually happens, though, is after the fielding is done, you have to do a tech refresh. And in the Army, things get to be expensive because 1 green T-shirt's cheap, 3 are affordable, but 3 million start to look like real numbers. And so this is the issue we have when you have to update all the computers associated with a particular technology.
The other, just to tack onto that, the other factor is there's a different philosophy in the digital world than in the sort of physical world. Google has things that are always in beta. So it's never done. None of these things are ever done. And that sort of runs the antithesis of traditional acquisitions where something's done and then you build a bunch of them.
In fact, we could list a bunch of pathologies that would keep us from doing what we want to do. But we've been the most creative Army since 1775. And you know, we've evolved, you know, every step of the way. And the other thing is I think as a community, you know, we are just, I've been amazed at this conference about how open it is. This has been the most open meeting and discussion about the Army that I've ever been to, this particular meeting. And, I mean, people are talking about the challenges and the problems, and they're being realistic. But on the other hand is we've got the capability to meet the challenges for 2025.
Yeah, we do, and I think the chief has said it. What he keeps trained and ready, and his most precious asset is manpower. So we can build on that. And what do these things cost? What's a DSTM? What's the unit price?
We'll go through the unit cost, but it's affordable. Well, what they have is, the objective is to do 129 systems we expect out there. We have 37 out there. We're building 15 right now for the National Guard, funded by the National Guard. And they'll get the latest upgrades. So we're upgrading from feedback from the early systems. We're upgrading the weapons characteristics and also the calibration to make it quicker.
It's less than one F-35.
But, you know, you have the echelon of the squad, that's interesting. Squads don't need to go on a report or,
Right.
I mean, all squads don't have to do that. And somebody pointed out, was pointed out, there's a lot of standing around where these squads and tanks sitting there in the German countryside, even worse with hard-boiled eggs. Live at large while the generals play around with what's going to happen next. But, you know, so you could in fact train squads fairly effectively on the number. I would suggest 35 squads. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, this is all cool. I think what we, you know, just speaking, I would see where what's that? What I'm trying to do is solve another problem. I've gone to another problem, which is another meeting in a place like this, where because we're out of Washington, people actually speak. Okay? And, you know, things are great. And by the way, coming with a nice shirt on without a necktie is okay too. And if I could ever break out of the East Coast mode, we probably would. Okay, now having said that, having one of those simulators here and showing people the Grecian urn and talking about this, Jim, I mean, we're going to have to get you out invisible so people start seeing you, some of this. Because I don't think people are aware of the advances that have been made. There's no doubt about it. In my mind, the microprocessor is our edge over virtually every other army in the world.
Yes.
In all kinds of ways. I mean, microprocessor is an old word, and it probably doesn't mean anything anymore, but I think you're onto something. I'm sure there's lots of things people want to talk about, but we're about out of airspeed and altitude, not to get into NASA's world. But by the way, I'm delighted to have this panel, the diversity here of the organizations represented. And one of the reasons I find Huntsville so attractive is, I know the University of Southern California is not here physically, but, you know, virtually you're here, you're representing them. But we have a lot of government agencies here with a lot of similar problems, and I think we need to leverage that in more meaningful ways. So anyway, we're going to have to stop. What do you, people have planes to catch, and
We only have 14 more questions.
14 more questions. By the way, just so everybody knows, in 1981, when I took that brigade, we could hardly talk from Bootsbach, from wherever, Kirchgorns down to Frankfurt. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah.
It was absolutely crazy. That's 1981. Look where we are today, how quickly that curve went up like a rocket. And who knows? And that's, I think, his problem. The people who equip the Army's problem is to keep up with this virtually 6 months. What you people work on changes every 6 months.
I had a pointed discussion with an 06 one day after I was briefing a flag officer and showing some of our systems, and they're cool, and I was asked, so how far along is this? You know, how soon can this, what's TRL and all of that? And I said, well, we can field some of this stuff right now. We've got prototypes that have trained over 70,000 warfighters. We've got stuff in Europe. We built some pretty robust prototypes. And then later on, I had the colonel pull me aside and say, don't tell a flag officer that he can have this in 6 months, because I can't put it on contract within 5 years. So that didn't stop me. I still am going to show you, and I'll show anybody else, the surface of the Mars lander in fully immersive 3D with our 5D viewer, or $5 viewer afterwards, because we can build these now. But again, I still come back to, we can do all this cool high-speed, low-drag stuff, but why are we doing it? How are we applying it? We know what we can do, but how are we going to do it, and why are we going to do it? And those are the deeper questions that we spend our nights thinking about.
Well, if you look at the problem that Sergeant Junta faced going up a ridgeline, and they get ambushed, and in about 30 seconds, he ran to get his buddy who was being carried away by the insurgents, killed a couple of guys, essentially broke the back of the L-shaped ambush, and it was with the regular old infantry squad, okay? And if you could put that on your iPad and sit down with a group of infantry soldiers or cavalry scouts or whatever, right around in a little circle around a campfire at night and say, okay, boys, look at this. Look what he did. Look what they did. That's leader development. That's learning. You're facilitating learning by showing them a picture.
Well, and the other thing that digital provides is, along with the what if, which is a critical aspect of it, is a deliberate practice environment. So you can give upfront instruction on certain things, and then you can give a very deliberate practice environment where you can control the variables, then you can change the variables, and then you can give an after-action review and give them that critical feedback, have mentors, have tracking of all of these sorts of things. My son is 17, he loves Team Fortress 2. He shoots people in Russia and all sorts of other countries online. They play these various maps, they work as a team, and I've watched him over time get to the point where I used to hear from his room, oh God, I suck, I'm getting killed again, blah, 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 to now it's, oh Dad, I got kicked off the server because they thought I was cheating and using an aimbot. And it's because he has learned the tactics. He's learned the environment. He's used how to learn, how to use the terrain to his advantage. And he has never gone out, I mean, he's gone to the desert and shot targets with me, but we don't go out and practice any of that sort of stuff. So there's a place for that. Now, when the rubber hits the road, would he be as effective? I would argue no. Back in the day, I used to race, club race cars, and when I was going to go run Laguna Seca racetrack. I got my PS3 and I plugged in Need for Speed and I ran Laguna Seca. I got up, got in my car, and that simulation didn't help me one bit, other than it looked cool. What was interesting was, after I had raced the track and felt the G-forces and all of those things, when I came back, I was really good at the game. Now, if we're moving towards an operational environment where I'm remotely piloting a vehicle, which is essentially a game, then maybe me doing that at NTC physically and then going back into the gaming environment is now going to... So again, it's flipping these things 180 degrees. Instead of using the game to practice for real, maybe we're using the real to practice for the game. And that's where we are in 2020, if not 2025, in 2050.